The year is 1926. The world outside hums with the nascent roar of prosperity, jazz music, and flapper dresses. But in the sleepy, forgotten hollow of Gilead, Illinois, time moves at a different, more languid pace. Gilead wasn't on any major map. A collection of weather-beaten homes clustered around a solitary, stoic church that had stood sentinel for nearly a century. Its steeple, once a proud beacon, now leaned slightly, its paint long faded to a ghostly white, mirroring the pallor of the town's dwindling population. The dust of decades seemed to cling to everything, a fine, almost palpable layer over memories and forgotten dreams. Life in Gilead was dictated by the seasons and the tolling of the church bell, a rhythm unbroken for generations. Most of the young had long since departed for the bright lights of Chicago or St. Louis, leaving behind a hardy, silent core of elders. These were people whose faces were etched with the stories of hard winters and sparse harvests, their eyes holding a deep, unspoken knowledge of the land and its secrets. They spoke little of the past, especially of the events that had cast a long, lingering shadow over their modest lives, preferring the comforting silence of routine. The church, named St. Jude's after a long-forgotten patron, was the heart of Gilead, even as its congregation dwindled to a handful of stooped figures. Its wooden doors, heavy and scarred, had creaked open for countless baptisms, weddings, and funerals. The pews, worn smooth by generations of fidgeting hands and bowed heads, seemed to hold the echoes of prayers whispered and hymns sung. But within its hallowed walls, there was a particular quietude, a hushed reverence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Central to the church's small sanctuary was the baptismal font, a massive, ornate stone basin carved from local granite. It stood at the back near the entrance, a silent, imposing fixture. Its surface, once polished, was now dulled by time, and the water within it, replenished infrequently, often held a faint, earthy scent, like the damp soil of a graveyard after a spring rain. For nearly half a century, it had remained untouched, its heavy lid sealed shut, a silent testament to a mystery that had long since been relegated to hushed whispers and averted gazes. No one in Gilead spoke directly of the font's peculiar status. Children were told to steer clear, though no explicit reason was ever given. The few visiting pastors who inquired were met with vague answers and a general shift in conversation. It was simply understood that the font was to remain undisturbed, a silent agreement born of a communal grief or perhaps a deeper, more unsettling fear. Its presence was a constant, subtle reminder of something lost, something that had curdled the very air of the small community. The summer of 1926 brought a heat wave unlike any in recent memory, a stifling blanket that settled over Gilead, making even the cicadas seem to hum with effort. It was amidst this oppressive heat that Elias Thorne arrived. Elias was not a man of God in the traditional sense, but a quiet, methodical historian, a self-taught archivist with a particular fascination for forgotten towns and their untold stories. He had heard whispers of Gilead, of its isolated nature and the peculiar reticence of its inhabitants regarding their past. Elias was a man of unassuming demeanor, with spectacles perched on a thin nose and a tweed jacket that seemed perpetually rumpled, even in the sweltering heat. He carried a worn leather satchel filled with notebooks, pencils, and a small, well-maintained camera. His approach to history was not about grand narratives but about the minute details, the forgotten names, and the quiet tragedies that often shape the destinies of places like Gilead. He sought out the unspoken, the things that lingered in the periphery of collective memory. He rented a small room above the general store, its windows overlooking the dusty main street. His days were spent poring over old church records, town ledgers, and faded newspaper clippings in the sparse county archives, often finding more gaps than information. The people of Gilead were polite but distant, their answers to his questions often clipped, steering clear of any topic that veered too close to the unspoken. Elias, however, was patient. He understood that some stories required time, like a stubborn stain needing persistent scrubbing. One sweltering afternoon, Elias found himself in the cool, dim interior of St. Jude's Church. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and beeswax, and the silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside. He ran his hand over the worn pews, admiring the simple, enduring craftsmanship. His gaze eventually fell upon the baptismal font, its presence both imposing and enigmatic. It was unlike any font he had ever seen, its proportions massive, its lid sealed with a rusted iron clasp. He approached it cautiously, drawn by an inexplicable pull. The stone felt cold even in the oppressive heat. He noted the intricate carvings on its base, now almost entirely obscured by a century of grime and neglect. It was then that he noticed the date etched faintly into the stone, almost hidden by a patch of moss. 1879. 47 years. The number resonated, connecting to the faint, almost imperceptible air of melancholia that seemed to permeate the church, and indeed, the entire town. He tried to lift the lid, but it was incredibly heavy, and the clasp, thick with rust, refused to budge. A shiver, despite the heat, traced its way down his spine. There was something profoundly unsettling about its sealed state, a sense of something deliberately hidden, preserved, or perhaps interred. The mystery of the font, he realized, was not just a historical curiosity, but the very heart of Gilead's enduring sorrow. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that the answers he sought lay within its stone embrace. Elias Thorne's inquiries about the font were met with the same wall of polite evasion he had encountered before. Old Man Hemlock, the church's ancient sexton, whose memory was as gnarled as the oak outside, simply shook his head. "Some things are best left alone, son," he rasped, his eyes clouded with cataracts, holding a deep, unreadable sadness. "That font, it holds a heavy peace. Others would simply turn away, their faces hardening slightly at the mention of the sealed basin." Determined, Elias turned his attention to the church's oldest records, searching for any mention of the font's sealing, or any event around the year 1879 that might explain its peculiar status. He meticulously sifted through baptismal registers, death certificates, and even old sermon notes, but found nothing explicit. There were gaps, pages missing, and entries that seemed deliberately vague. It was as if a portion of Gilead's history had been meticulously, almost surgically removed. He did, however, find a subtle shift in the records around that time, a sudden, sharp decline in baptismal entries, followed by a period where no new names appeared at all for several years. There was also an unusual spike in deaths, particularly among infants and young children, a cluster of entries marked simply fever or wasting illness, but the sheer number seemed disproportionate, even for the harsh realities of the late 19th century. It hinted at something more widespread, more devastating than a typical seasonal ailment. Elias spent his evenings by the flickering lamplight in his rented room, cross-referencing names, tracing family lines that abruptly ended or dispersed. He began to piece together a fragmented picture of a community gripped by an unknown terror. Old Mr. Hemlock, in one of his more lucid moments, spoke of a shadow sickness that had swept through Gilead in 79, taking the young and the vulnerable first. He spoke of mothers weeping inconsolably, of silent funerals, and of a town that had fallen into a deep, pervasive quiet. The pieces began to coalesce into a chilling hypothesis. What if the font, meant for life, had become a repository for death? What if, in their desperation, the people of Gilead had performed some final, desperate rite, sealing away not just a memory, but something tangible? The thought sent a cold tendril of dread up Elias's spine. It was a dark possibility, one that resonated with the profound silence and veiled sorrow that permeated the very air of Gilead. The reluctance to speak, he realized, was not merely about forgetting, but about guarding a deeply buried, painful truth. He knew then that he had to open the font. It was no longer just about historical inquiry. It was about honoring the forgotten, about unearthing a truth that had been unjustly buried for nearly half a century. The thought of what he might find within its depths was terrifying. But the weight of the unanswered questions, the silent suffering of Gilead, compelled him forward. He understood that some secrets, no matter how painful, demand to be brought into the light. The decision to open the font was not made lightly, nor was it easy to execute. Elias knew he couldn't simply force it open. He needed assistance, and more importantly, he needed to respect the fragile peace that had settled over Gilead, however uneasy it was. He approached Mr. Hemlock again, this time with a more direct plea, explaining his conviction that understanding the past was the only way for the town to truly move forward. After much persuasion and a shared quiet moment in the empty church, the old sexton, his hands trembling, finally agreed. "There are keys," Mr. Hemlock whispered, his voice barely audible, "hidden, for when the time was right." He led Elias to a loose stone in the church's foundation, behind the altar, revealing a small velvet-lined box. Inside lay a set of 3 antique iron keys, intricately wrought and heavy with the patina of age. Each key was unique, suggesting a complex locking mechanism, a deliberate act to ensure the font remained sealed against prying eyes. The weight of them in Elias's hand felt immense, almost sacred. The next morning, under a sky that seemed to mirror the solemnity of the occasion, Elias and Mr. Hemlock returned to St. Jude's. The only other person present was Silas, a burly, taciturn farmer who had, over the weeks, developed a grudging respect for Elias's quiet persistence. Silas had brought a heavy crowbar, an old lantern, and a length of thick rope, his face grim, his movements deliberate. The air in the church was thick with anticipation, a heavy silence punctuated only by their quiet breaths. With immense effort, they worked together. The first key turned with a groan of rusted metal, followed by the second, and then the third. The iron clasp, protesting decades of disuse, finally sprung open with a sharp, resonant clang that echoed through the quiet church. A faint, almost imperceptible draft seemed to stir the dust motes in the shaft of sunlight filtering through the stained glass window. Elias felt his heart pound in his chest, a drum beat against the profound silence. Silas, with a grunt of effort, positioned the crowbar under the massive stone lid. Elias and Mr. Hemlock braced themselves, their hands gripping the cold, rough stone. Slowly, agonizingly, the lid began to lift, scraping against the stone base with a sound like a drawn-out sigh. A musty, earthy odor, like that of an ancient crypt, wafted from within. A smell that was both unsettling and strangely familiar, like the scent of old memories. The darkness beneath seemed to swallow the light. As the lid was finally raised and carefully set aside, the faint light from the window penetrated the depths of the font. What they saw within was not water, as Elias had expected, but a collection of small, wrapped bundles, carefully placed. They were old, discolored with age, wrapped in what appeared to be linen and tightly bound with faded ribbons. Each bundle was small, too small for anything but. Elias felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The truth, long buried, was about to emerge. The sight within the font was not one of horror in the traditional sense, but of profound, aching sorrow. There were indeed small bundles, perhaps a dozen or more, each no larger than a newborn child. They lay nestled together, some almost disintegrated by time, others remarkably preserved by the cool, dry air within the sealed stone basin. Elias, overcome by a mix of dread and a strange, mournful reverence, knelt before the font, his breath catching in his throat. With a trembling hand, he carefully reached in and lifted one of the bundles. It was surprisingly light, and as he gently unwrapped the faded linen, the contents were revealed. Not bones, as some dark corner of his mind had half expected, but small, beautifully carved wooden figures. Each was meticulously crafted, depicting a tiny infant, wrapped in swaddling clothes. They were not crude effigies, but delicate works of art, each bearing a faint, almost invisible inscription on its base. He unwrapped another, then another. Each bundle contained a similar wooden figure, unique in its subtle carving. but all unmistakably representing a swaddled child. And then, in the folds of one of the linens, he found something else, a small, tarnished silver locket, no bigger than a thumbnail. With careful fingers, Elias pried it open. Inside, faded beyond recognition, were two tiny, almost ethereal strands of baby-fine hair, braided together, one dark, one impossibly fair. Mr. Hemlock, his face ashen, stumbled backward, leaning heavily against a pew. Silas, normally stoic, averted his gaze, a single tear tracking a path through the dust on his cheek. The silence in the church was now heavy with the weight of unspoken grief, a collective wail of forgotten mothers and fathers. The realization dawned on Elias. These were not merely symbolic figures. Each one represented a child lost in the shadow sickness of 1879, each perhaps holding a fragment of their very essence, a lock of hair, a tiny garment. The inscriptions on the bases of the wooden figures, when Elias could finally decipher them, were names: Elias infant, Mary, born still, Thomas, 3 months. These were the lost children of Gilead, those who had succumbed to the epidemic. The community, in their profound grief and desperation, had not buried them in the cold earth, but had entrusted their memory, their very spirit, to the sacred font, sealing it as a perpetual, private tomb. It was a desperate act of love, a desire to keep their children forever close, forever consecrated. The water, Elias now understood, had long since evaporated, leaving only these precious, hallowed remains. The font meant for new life had become a vessel for eternal rest, a monument to a grief so deep it had reshaped the very soul of the town. The silence of Gilead, the averted gazes, the fear of disturbing the font. It was not about a curse, but about respecting a sacred trust, a promise made to the lost generation. The discovery in the font changed everything, yet nothing at all, in Gilead. The secret was out, but it was not a secret of scandal or sin, but of profound, shared sorrow. Elias and Mr. Hemlock, with Silas's quiet help, carefully documented each wooden figure, each tiny relic. They laid them out on the altar, a silent, poignant procession of lost souls. The air in the church, once heavy with an undefined dread, now vibrated with a palpable sense of mournful tenderness. Word of the unveiling spread quickly, not through gossip but through the quiet, intuitive understanding that permeates small towns. One by one, the remaining elders of Gilead began to arrive at the church. They stood at the entrance, hesitant at first, then slowly, drawn by an invisible thread, they walked down the aisle. Their faces were etched with a mix of recognition, pain, and a strange, almost palpable sense of release. Some wept silently, others simply stared, their eyes distant, lost in memories. Old Mrs. Albright, her hands gnarled with age, pointed a trembling finger at one of the small figures. "That's little Sarah," she whispered, her voice raspy with emotion. "My grandmother's sister. They said she just faded away." Another, a gaunt farmer named Jed, nodded slowly. "My great-uncle Peter. Never saw a year. He didn't." The names, once lost to time, began to be spoken aloud, gentle whispers filling the hallowed space. Each wooden figure became a bridge to a past that had been too painful to confront directly. Elias realized the true genius of the people of Gilead. By sealing the font, they had not just buried their grief, but had preserved it, sanctified it. It was a communal memorial, a shared grave, kept safe from the ravages of time and the casual indifference of the outside world. The font had not been a source of malevolent power, but a silent guardian of fragile, beloved memories. It had held the echoes of sorrow, waiting for a time when the town was ready to finally acknowledge, and perhaps begin to heal from, its deepest wound. The atmosphere in Gilead shifted subtly. The heavy silence began to lift, replaced by a softer, more reflective quiet. People began to speak. Cautiously at first, then with increasing candor, of the shadow sickness, of 79, of the fear and the overwhelming sense of helplessness. They spoke of the desperate prayers, of the community coming together in their shared agony, and of the decision, born of love and desperation, to entrust their little ones to the Sacred Heart of the Church. The weight of memory, once a burden, began to transform into a shared heritage. The font, no longer a forbidden object, became a symbol of resilience, of enduring love, in the face of unimaginable loss. It was a testament to the human spirit's capacity to find beauty and meaning even in the darkest corners of despair. Elias, the historian, had found more than just a forgotten case. He had stumbled upon a profound act of communal remembrance. After the initial revelation, the people of Gilead began a quiet, almost ceremonial process of re-engaging with the font. They did not remove the wooden figures. Instead, they cleaned the basin with reverent care, the ancient stone gleaming faintly in the dim light. Fresh, clear water was poured into its depths, reflecting the solemn faces gathered around it. It was as if, after decades of silence, the font had finally been allowed to breathe, to once again fulfill its purpose, not for baptism, but for remembrance. Elias, having achieved what he came for, felt a strange reluctance to leave. He had become an unexpected confidant, a quiet witness to Gilead's slow process of healing. He spent his days in the church, making sketches of the figures, meticulously noting the names and any details shared by the elders. He felt a deep sense of connection to these lost children, their silent stories finally being heard. The church, once a somber, almost oppressive place, now felt imbued with a profound sense of peace. The presence of the wooden figures, enshrined within the font, seemed to create a new atmosphere in Gilead. The children of the town, once warned away, were now brought to the church. Their parents and grandparents would gently explain the story of the little sleepers, fostering a new generation's understanding of their town's unique history. It was a delicate, tender process of passing on a painful truth, ensuring that the lost children would never truly be forgotten again. Yet, despite the newfound openness, a subtle, almost imperceptible air of melancholia continued to linger in Gilead. It wasn't the heavy dread of before, but a soft, pervasive sadness, like the scent of dried flowers in an old book. The echoes of the past, though acknowledged, were not entirely dispelled. The lost children, though named and remembered, remained a haunting presence, a quiet reminder of life's fragile beauty and the suddenness with which it could be extinguished. Elias often found himself staring into the depths of the font, the wooden figures silent beneath the clear water. He would wonder about the lives they might have led, the laughter they never uttered, the futures that were stolen too soon. The mystery of the font, while solved in its physical sense, had only deepened in its emotional resonance. It was a testament to the enduring power of grief, and the lengths to which a community would go to preserve the memory of its beloved. The secret had been unveiled, but the haunting quality remained. It was a haunting not of ghosts or malevolent spirits, but of love, loss, and the quiet, persistent echo of what might have been. Gilead, in its raw vulnerability, had opened its heart, and in doing so, had revealed a story that resonated far beyond its dusty borders, a universal tale of human sorrow and the enduring strength of memory. As the autumn leaves began to turn in Gilead, painting the hillsides in hues of rust and gold, Elias Thorne prepared to depart. He had gathered his notes, his sketches, and his photographs, a quiet archive of the town's hidden history. He knew he would carry the story of the baptismal font with him always, a poignant reminder of the fragile line between memory and oblivion, and the profound ways in which communities cope with unimaginable loss. His final visit to the church was a solitary one. The sunlight, now filtered through the crimson and amber leaves outside, cast a warm, shifting glow on the baptismal font. The water shimmered, and beneath its surface, the tiny wooden figures seemed to stir, silent witnesses to the passage of time. He reached out, touching the cold stone of the font's rim, a silent farewell to the little sleepers and the town that had so fiercely guarded their memory. The people of Gilead, though still quiet and reserved, had changed. There was a lightness in their step, a subtle softening in their gazes. The burden they had carried for 47 years had been acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement, a different kind of peace had settled. It was not a peace of forgetting, but a peace found in shared understanding and collective remembrance. The font, once a symbol of a buried secret, had become a conduit for healing, a sacred heart for a town that had endured the unthinkable. Elias often thought about the shadow sickness and the desperate acts of love that followed. He wondered if other forgotten towns held similar secrets, similar acts of quiet, communal grief. The world moved on, but in places like Gilead, the past remained a living, breathing entity, shaping the present in subtle, profound ways. The story of the font was not a grim tale of horror, but a deeply human one, a testament to the enduring power of love and remembrance in the face of insurmountable sorrow. He left Gilead as quietly as he had arrived, carrying with him not just a story, but a deep respect for the resilience of the human spirit. The road out of town was dusty, just as it had been on his arrival, but now the landscape seemed imbued with a deeper, more resonant quietude. The steeple of St. Jude's, though still leaning, seemed to stand a little taller against the fading light, a silent sentinel over a secret no longer buried, but forever enshrined. The story of what they found in the baptismal font in 1926 Illinois would indeed haunt those who heard it, not with fear, but with a lingering sense of sorrow, a profound understanding of loss, and the enduring echo of the tiny lives that had found their eternal resting place in consecrated stone. The mystery was solved, but the emotional truth of it would resonate, a soft, persistent whisper across the decades, forever woven into the quiet, resilient heart of Gilead.
If you like this type of stories, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.